I want to turn to you, Inaya, because a lot of people find art, like this particular painting, offensive. How do we engage with people who find it offensive? How do we contextualize art like this, or do we even?
I think what Kholood's description of this artwork actually really just highlights the importance of displaying it, because it's actually such a rich source of intellectual, artistic, moral and political history that can be illuminated and discussed from just one piece of artwork, regardless of what you might think of the history itself. And I think if we use offence as the yardstick for whether or not we should display or discuss particular representations and so on, and I think that we're in a very worrying place, because as obvious as it sounds, human beings, we are by definition diverse. We're informed by different cultures, different histories, different religions, and that undoubtedly will lead to many different interpretations of particular events and particular representations. And I think the thing is about art itself is oftentimes the most thought-provoking and compelling artworks are deeply offensive, because they challenge us and ask us to question often deeply held taboos. And there's many things now that we do take for granted, whether that is equality for women or other values and so on, that at one point in history were regarded as both fringe and offensive to the orthodoxy at the time. So I don't think offense is a very compelling reason to not depict something or not to discuss something, because one person's offence could be someone else's completely different view. So in terms of how we actually engage with these kinds of artworks and historically contextualize them, as you mentioned, I think my starting point is to recognize that two very mutually exclusive, often opposing views can even have very compelling, meaningful and sincere justifications for those views. And I think that as long as we keep the space open to allow those perspectives to be discussed, and this is not to say that everything should be relative and there are no standards. Of course we should negotiate right and wrong, but I think we have to start from the perspective that as long as we keep the space as open as possible, as citizens, as human beings, we can come to different conclusions, and that is okay. I think that there is also a kind of stereotyping of the West that is going on in much of this discussion. Actually, the West, just as quote-unquote the East, is full of diverse cultures and heritages and political ideologies and movements. And actually, we have referenced Edward Said's Orientalism, which is taught across Western universities, and actually, even the time when he wrote the famous works, he was welcomed amongst the European and Western intellectuals with open arms. His book was widely praised. So there are very strong strands within Western thought that is incredibly self-critical, that has recognized past wrongs and present wrongs as well, and is very much engaged in that dialogue of bringing in lots of different perspectives and trying to understand the way in which different groups in different countries have been misinterpreted. So I think that that's a really important point to recognize the diversity of the West and the ideologies within it without essentializing it and stereotyping it also. But I also think there's a human point here that the imagination is always limited insofar as in order to draw representations of other things, we are always going to get it wrong, we're always going to misinterpret, because the nature of the imagination itself is mysterious and elusive. And so the idea that the only thing that is valid or important or correct is exact, accurate reflections of particular countries or communities, then I don't really know what art would be then, because art in and of itself is something that is always a distortion of what the actual reality is. So I think that actually if we are going down this line, that the only important point to take from the artworks that we've seen in other things is whether or not it's accurate, then I think we'd miss the beauty of it, its artistic value, whether or not it's depicting things in a exciting or skillful way. So there are other questions to ask, not just whether or not it's an exact, accurate reflection.
Where do we draw the line between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation?
I think intention matters. I think that that's a really important way that we have to recognize that. Was her intention in depicting that to dehumanize, to degrade? Of course not. It was an artistic expression. I think there's a real danger in seeing cultures as these fixed, distinct, things that have these rigid borders that other people cannot interact with and exchange things. Actually, when we see different cultures, you often find upon deeper investigation that the lines are actually quite blurry, and there's been many ways in which the East, so-called, has influenced Western thought and Western discourse substantially, and vice versa. And for example, I recently came back from Japan, and there is a huge American culture of Japanese people wearing Elvis-inspired clothes, also inspired by African American hip-hop culture, and I think that that is a glorious example of human creativity and human expression, reinventing things. And they don't need permission from African American people. They don't need permission from supporters of Elvis in America. That is the free-flowing nature of human beings. And I think that when we police intercultural exchange, and I think what we're actually doing is retreating further into our silos, and what it will ultimately lead is less understanding of different communities and different cultures, because we will not have that free-flowing way to interact.
Are stereotypes, by definition, always inherently negative?
Well, on the point about techno-Orientalism, I think that's quite an interesting one because, having spent some time in Asia and obviously being someone that was born and raised in the West, actually I would say there's a lot of admiration for the technological advancements that many countries in East Asia has made, whether that's South Korea, Japan, and so on and so forth. So, and also, cyberpunk from Japan has had a huge influence on video gaming culture within Western society as well. So again, I think there's always there are these nuances and complexities that I think Orientalism as a concept often just removes and often reinforces this East versus West idea. So, for example, actually, I've seen a huge change in the way the Far East has been depicted over the last few decades due to the fact that they have economically advanced substantially. So growing up, I can admit that there were these depictions of the Far East as underdeveloped and all sorts of negative stereotyping. But the context has transformed to such an extent where many of these voices are now making themselves heard and are completely shaping the way that they are depicted. So I think that we have to be careful not to remove the agency from many people themselves that actually push back, that shape Western thought as well, and actually redefine their own stories. And that relationship is constantly going and ongoing.
Inaya, you're very plugged into the art scene, as we mentioned in the introduction. Tell me about your thoughts about this decolonize the arts movement. Do you support it?
So I have my concerns about it. So undoubtedly, I think I welcome the idea that we should make us more aware of stories that were historically marginalized, perspectives and voices that were not included in how we understand particular historical events, particular literature, particular artistic forms, and so on. But I think that there's a danger in really blurring what we mean by decolonization. To me, I think decolonization is the kind of formal political process of removing a colonial power. I think there's a very different thing when we talk about decolonization when it comes to art, when it comes to ideas. As I've alluded to in previous elements of this discussion, actually, history is much more complicated than just seeing it through a binary racial lens or seeing it through an East versus West lens. And actually, oftentimes, marginalized and colonial voices use the ideas of the Enlightenment, use lots of Western ideas as a way to hold a mirror to the West against their ability to live up to their own ideals. And so when we're talking about decolonization, what ideas are we actually removing? Is it ideas of parliamentary democracy? Is it ideas of so many things that the West has championed in many ways as well? So I do think that whilst we should open the perspective to lots of different voices, I think that there is a danger in essentially, again, reinforcing a division which sees certain ideas as only Western or certain depictions as only Western and everything else is as a victim or everything else as Eastern. And again, I don't think history is as binary as that.